Just going to let everybody get in the room. Welcome to today's webinar on key trends in responsible sourcing. Thank you for joining us as the numbers fill up, taking your virtual seats. Great to see so many of you online already. Hopefully we won't hit our maximum cap, but if we do, we'll obviously have to do this again. So thank you for joining. My name is Will. I will be your host today. My role at Sedex is to help businesses achieve their responsible and ethical sourcing goals. Of course, in case anyone isn't aware, at Sedex, we help companies manage and improve working conditions in their global supply chains. Today, we're going to cover a series of topics and trends in responsible sourcing and key focus areas for businesses to be aware of. The format is pretty informal. There are no slides, so don't panic. And we're going to cover a couple of discussion points around responsible sourcing trends. If it gets too technical, I'll interrupt, but do also feel free to fire questions into the chat, as we've set some time aside for these at the end. And we're also recording today's session. So today, we're going to be discussing some key trends, such as audits don't fix everything, putting workers front and center, the technology nirvana, and measuring impacts, not outputs. To help us with this, it's my pleasure to introduce Head of Responsible Sourcing, Tristan Edmondson, and Head of Social Impact, Kate Robinson. Welcome to you both. To get us started, perhaps we should first answer, what is responsible sourcing?
Thanks, Will. What is responsible sourcing? Well, for most companies that sell products like construction firms, manufacturing firms, farms, food processors, their big impact is in the supply chain. In fact, return and distribution, probably from an environmental and social impact point of view, is fairly minor. In the supply chain, there are several topics that we cover with responsible sourcing. The one you're probably most familiar with from factory scandals is labour rights and working conditions. But we also look carefully at health and safety, at environment and business ethics, which covers things like corruption. But it's not just at the direct suppliers for big retailers and big brands, big food processors. It's also at their suppliers. And as you further go down into the supply chain, sometimes you find bigger risks. But why does this happen? Why do we have this industry of responsible sourcing? Well, it's driven mostly by customer pressure. That's the fear of reputational damage, but also a big part of it is about regulation. We'll talk a bit later about some of those regulations in the UK, the EU, and abroad. And then we're also seeing a lot of investors interested in the performance of responsible supply chain and the companies that they buy. But how do you actually do that? What do you actually do if you're a business and you want to start doing responsible sourcing? Well, it's about due diligence. And in several ways, it's about taking all of your suppliers and focusing down on the ones that need your help. And the way you do that is you, first of all, you look at the inherent risk in your supply chain. So that's the kind of products you're buying. You're buying palm oil. There's very particular risks to do with palm oil. If you're operating in some countries where labour rights are not protected as well, then that's an inherent risk. So you use that filter, first of all. The next filter you'd use is then looking at individual sites, sending them supply questionnaires, carrying out on-site audits like SMETA with Sedex, surveying workers there. And then once the final filter is then once you understand the risks or the issues or the challenges at those sites, how do you then help those suppliers to improve? How do you identify the gaps that they have? And how do you collaborate with them to do that? And one very important way that we do assessment at Sedex is the SMETA audit, which is really it's the world's largest ethical trade responsible sourcing audit. And what that SMETA audit is all about is spending 1 or 2 or 3 days at a site and understanding the basic management processes, triangulating worker interviews, management interviews, doing a site tour, looking at records, and then producing a report and giving a baseline assessment for that site. So that's really kind of responsible sourcing in a nutshell.
Thanks for that, Tristan. And you know, quite a lot in there. You mentioned audits and specifically a SMETA audit, but audits aren't really everything, are they? They're a bit of a snapshot and a point in time. What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the way that Tristan described due diligence is the bit to focus on. You know, this is about the first step is assessment. And an audit is a kind of risk assessment, and it's really good at some things and it's less good at other things. So I think it's important to use audits in a context where you know what it is useful for. It's useful for providing a snapshot. It's particularly good at identifying sort of visible risk to workers, like occupational health and safety risks and hazards. It's less effective at identifying things that are less visible, kind of ongoing rights abuses that happen behind the scenes. Not every manager on site is performing to the best of their abilities when it comes to their worker welfare. So audits don't always pick up things like that. So we have to think of it as a tool that is really effective for that kind of initial risk assessment. It has to be complemented by a suite of other approaches to assessment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Sorry, Will, what was your question?
Sorry, what's your view on that, Tristan?
I mean, I agree. I think that for a lot of people, responsible sourcing is audit, and they think that an audit is a magic bullet. You have 1,200 suppliers in your first tier, your direct suppliers in your supply chain. Audit them all, and you're done. You've fixed the problem. But of course, audits have their limitations. They're an excellent tool for a baseline assessment, but they're a starting point for a much bigger conversation with suppliers.
Really interesting, because I think we talked to a lot of businesses, and they kind of think, well, we do audits, that we're fine, aren't we? And that isn't what the case what you're saying there, Tristan.
No, I mean, an audit, any form of audit, whether it's a SMETA audit or any other responsible sourcing audit, is going to not find every issue at a site, because it's a snapshot, as you said earlier. It's a snapshot on one day that the supplier presents you with a certain way of looking at a site, which may not, if we're looking at some of the worst kinds of exploitation, the kind of criminal, semi-criminal modern slavery, then the workers are not going to be telling auditors during interview about that kind of really severe exploitation, and the supplier is going to be working pretty hard to keep that hidden. And so if you have that knowledge that you think that kind of thing may be happening at a site, then you need to do an audit first of all to understand all the management systems and what's happening there. But you need to go beyond that. You need to take the next step and look at some of the other approaches to do with more effective assessment for particular risks.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned workers there. What's the role of workers in risk assessment then?
That to me. So, I mean, there's different approaches. The sort of classic approach to audit has involved a few questions to workers by the auditor on site. But I think, the world's sort of changing from this concept of a compliance-driven approach, which is how audits first developed after, various scandals in the 90s. We know that there's a few reasons why workers need to be involved. The effectiveness of the audit massively increases if workers are themselves identifying and sharing what their challenges are, what their perceived risks are. Why wouldn't you ask workers to input on that level? I think more broadly as well, we've changed in the last 20, 30 years of thinking about sustainability and not beyond responsible sourcing, in that the compliance agenda is quite top down. It's this idea of an international business assessing down a supply chain so that business can manage risks. And of course, that's still important. That's part of our legal framework and business context. But increasingly, I think we're recognizing that businesses aren't operating in isolation. They operate in a context. They are operating very often in a very challenging context where maybe the rule of law is insufficient, or there is not enough kind of labour inspectorate support. Challenges aren't only for an individual manager at a supplier site. This is about systems, market systems. So the worker voice piece is really, really critical in kind of shifting the narrative away from that compliance data up piece of extraction, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah,
interesting. Work voice can be seen as a bit of a tick box exercise to show big businesses showing that they're doing the right thing. But is there a real business benefit to companies doing this?
definitely. I think that Kate touched on points about how if you're not communicating with your workers effectively, then you're not going to keep them. They're not going to stay at your business. And so worker voice sometimes has been treated by some big businesses as a tick box exercise. We do some worker surveys, we know what they want, and we're done. But the key is ongoing communication and putting what workers want at the center of a responsible sourcing process. And audit plays an important role in doing that, in that perhaps it shouldn't be just about the worker interviews, but an audit is really about making sure that a business has those management systems in place to make sure that they're collecting workers' opinions and views, that they're prioritizing them against what they can or they can't do, and they're communicating back to the workforce what they're able to improve about their working lives and what they can't improve about their working lives, and to have that as a continual process. And that's really good worker voice, rather than doing a survey and forgetting about it, or just doing one audit, which does have worker voice in it inherently from worker interviews, but that's just the very start of a process.
Yeah, building on that, it's definitely, worker voice is a step towards improved employer-worker relationships, right? So the extent to which an audit can support that building of a relationship, more the better. But there are other routes, of course. Audit itself can't improve worker-manager relationships. It's an assessment tool. The real bit that, the future of responsible sourcing, we're here to talk about trends. I think there's a shift in what is the assessment for? It's great to identify what the risks are, tick box, right? But actually, if we're looking at improving and creating change for workers, all the environment and all other issues beyond as well, this is about building on the knowledge of what the risks are and saying, great, so what? What are we going to do about it? What's next? Is anything changing? What's our action plan? And I think that's really coming into the fore this year. We'll talk about legislation, I'm sure, but so many drivers for why we're now thinking about this as improvement and supporting suppliers as employers to manage their workforces in more kind of meaningful ways, I suppose, where it's not happening.
Does that answer the question about which I think is a crucial one, about the business case for worker communication? I mean, I would also add from a slightly selfish point of view that you get better productivity, you get better quality products if you have a motivated and engaged workforce. And one of the biggest issues that workers have reported to me when I've visited factories, especially in China, is that they don't always feel respected or treated well by their direct supervisors, and that's difficult to measure in an audit, and that's difficult to measure with some traditional worker voice tools. But it's the main reason why people don't operate well at work, why they leave work, and they're not, or why they don't make quality products, because they're not given the direction and the supervision that they need to do their job well. So there are some really important reasons why we need to get working conditions right, especially in suppliers who perhaps have grown very quickly and their management systems haven't followed that growth, unsurprisingly.
Yeah. So how do you extend workers' voice into suppliers there? I mean, how do you get that reach for businesses?
From an audit methodology point of view, or kind of bigger picture?
Probably generally, I think.
Yeah, probably
Generally.
both. I want to take
Yeah.
each.
Yeah, I mean, as Tristan will speak better to the audit methodology piece. I mean, kind of zooming out again, thinking of this as due diligence. Assessment is more effective at highlighting risks when the people impacted by the risks get a chance to say what the risks are, right? It's just logical sense. So the way that you gather that information can be in multiple different ways, obviously enhancing worker voice through audit, but there's other tools available. I think technology here is playing quite an interesting role with various kind of worker apps, different levels, different countries are seeing these things popping up all the time. Education materials so that workers know what their rights are and are able to better articulate that, both through an assessment process, but also directly to their management. So there's quite a lot of innovation in this space, I think. I shouldn't finish my sentence though without also going back to kind of old school traditional ways of worker voice. This is, it's quite an industrial relations topic. We shouldn't forget about, you know, right to organise and collective bargaining and so on. This is about the ability of workers to raise a collective voice. Do they have the right to organise? Are they given the freedom to do that so that they can negotiate their terms and conditions? And we still see a lot of disparity across the world in the ability for that kind of fundamental ILO right to take place.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you say that, Kate, and Tristan as well, to your point around that business benefit. I think there's an element of, you know, doing this because it's the right thing to do, but those tangible benefits, they are quite difficult to measure. And I know we're going to talk a bit about that later, but I think that kind of feeling part of a business and being part of the global business rather than in the factory or the site that you might be talking to is really important to that. We mentioned a little bit around technology there, Kate, which brings us nicely on to our next topic, which is the Tech Nirvana. You can't really look at any industry at the moment without hearing about tech disruption or the next big thing, whether it's blockchain, machine learning, whatever it might be. Looking at specifically responsible sourcing and the trends in this space, what's the value of tech, Tristan?
I mean, when we were discussing this topic in preparation for the webinar, you know, my initial feeling was, which is hence the title of the section, you know, people have been promising the world with technology and responsible sourcing for years, and you know, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen this magical silver bullet which would just make our job so much more impactful. But then I kind of realized, actually, Sedex is the original responsible sourcing nirvana. Well, maybe not a nirvana, but quite a pleasant destination.
Say that, hey, Tristan.
A pleasant destination. It is one of the original tech solutions, which I think brings us on to, you know, how do you actually kind of process or structure all of the tech solutions that are coming along, which is that they're not going to change the way that companies source. They're not going to change the way that suppliers employ people. They're not going to change the way that we help big businesses to do responsible sourcing. But they can make it much more effective, and they can make it much cheaper and more cost effective to actually implement, of which Sedex is a great example. You know, the ability to put all of your data into one platform and to share it has really changed the scale at which we can do responsible sourcing. But there are some innovations which show promise, perhaps they're a little bit above and beyond, you know, that I think show real promise. So one of them is predictive learning and artificial intelligence, and we're seeing some innovations certainly within Sedex and some of our peer companies where we are able to predict the likely occurrence of some of the worst forms of exploitation with fairly good accuracy, and that's one of the most exciting elements that could change things perhaps a bit more than my slightly cynical traditional view of tech, that, you know, it's still rooted in people and traditional power relations. But predictive analysis, you know, if we could take all of our Sedex data and tell you exactly which sites we're going to find the worst forms of modern slavery, then that could be a good game changer, and we're working towards that. What do you think, Kate?
Oh, I'm aware of the irony of saying this sitting at Sedex, the original tech provider solution, right? But I'm still skeptical, which is why I want results. I want to know how better data changes things. So I think we are getting better as an industry at assessment. We're getting improved data quality. We're working on data quality all the time here at Sedex, and I know many of our peers are doing the same. So improve the quality of the data that comes in, you improve the insight that comes out, fine. But improved assessment isn't the game changer. For me, it's about what you do with that. So it's as you move into the prevention and remedy space, back to that due diligence sort of cycle, the potential for tech is, I think, is most exciting in that prevention space. How can we use technology to integrate our various data points into sort of generate an action plan, as it were, or kind of inform the ideas on who we should be working with that go beyond our own business? What stakeholders are feeding into this, and who can we be, what are national laws saying? What can we do differently? So if we can pull that data together to form a more cohesive, coherent oversight, insight into what's actually happening in global supply chains, I think we're getting closer towards the bit that I want, which is the results, right? I want demonstrable results.
Do you think technology can help us with kind of some of the radical transparency? I'm thinking of a really interesting call we had with the Open Power Registry this week. That can we have a game changer in that kind of space?
In terms of transparency?
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, well, again, transparency as a concept has been around for a long time, but let's have the results of it. Let's see what's happening. I think there's a risk with the transparency argument that there's an assumption that the world looks at this information and that civil society holds somebody to account, or that government uses it in this way or that way. I think we need to go a bit beyond that and sort of almost formalize what the data is for. So it's quite exciting when you think about how, say, the investment community is using ESG data to make investment decisions. More of this, right? So that the data that's out there is used to make decisions. That's what the connection that we need to make. That's it. I mean, I'm 100% in favour of the transparency argument, and I think there's a load of innovation, tech and otherwise, out there. Lots of organisations looking at the power of data to transform decision making, which is fantastic.
Interesting that you say there, Kate, around transparency. So whether it's freedom of information requests, etc., just because the information is available, is anybody looking at it and anybody making those decisions, is informing decisions and policy that's going to make a real life impact? Tristan, you mentioned something briefly there when you were talking about technology, about how it's still having a human element and those power relations. There's a lot been said about how algorithms can actually have bias inbuilt. Have you thought about or come across that at all on the RS space?
Yeah, I mean, when we're looking at our own work or other people's work into artificial intelligence in terms of predicting which sites we think will be highest risk, what's quite difficult about it is that we can't really explain how the algorithms work. We can't actually say, because a human mind can't comprehend the wealth of data points that a machine will take and understand the context for that site based on what it's learned about other instances of modern slavery and why it says this site will have modern slavery. And so because we can't, as humans, explain that particular site, it makes it quite, those are then difficult conversations to have with the site or with whoever's sourcing there. And so you're right, we have to be very careful with the biases that we build into that machine learning process. And it is, and it's part of the reason perhaps why it hasn't become widespread yet. There are real risks involved in unleashing machines on our data and then taking quite serious decisions about what we think about certain sites or suppliers or regions or supply chains based on those assumptions. So there are real risks, and you're right to flag them.
Interesting. I mean, looking at tech and how it supports responsible sourcing and the agenda, and we talk a lot at Sedex about continuous improvement. So we mentioned about audits just being a snapshot and a point in time. Can technology support that approach of continuous improvement and going beyond just risk assessment? Ultimately, how do we know what's working and what's not if we have to continuously go back to the assessment point again.
Yeah, go on. Well,
you go.
My original point around, technology can really help us to reduce costs and increase scale. And in that way, what holds back a lot of businesses and buying companies from offering a lot of support remediation is the fact that they might have thousands as first tier for direct suppliers in their supply chain, and they can't offer the kind of individual support for remediating any issues found there. But with technology, and certainly we're looking at how we build this into SMETA and the new Sedex platform, is that you can give targeted support where you find particular issues in a much more efficient and cost-effective way than before. You'd have to have a big team of people whose sole job was to do that. Now, that's not a magic bullet either. Giving targeted, let's say, guidance on a management system for worker voice where an audit surfaces that problem doesn't necessarily fix it. The site also has to want to absorb that information, and they also have to be able to then act on it. And somebody then has to follow up and see whether the site actually can use that guidance to create the right kind of freely elected worker committee that gives them the results they need. So there are, and which is to Kate's point, the human element is still there.
I think we have to, I think it's a really important question. I think we have to think about the drivers of the problems. We have to understand drivers of the problems and responsibility for the solutions. And this is the shift. The compliance lens is about, the driver of the solution. The kind of assumption behind that is that it's site level, therefore site can fix it. And that in many cases is the case. In many cases, it's the case, if I can say that. I just did. But the world is more complicated than that. Suppliers are often operating in a context, as I talked about earlier, that is kind of beyond their control. Everyone else is doing it. It costs them more money to make adjustments to whatever issues being raised through an audit or another risk assessment approach. So we have to kind of think about those root causes. It's not always site level. If it isn't site level, what are we going to do about it, and where does responsibility sit? And that's kind of more the narrative of sort of beyond compliance as an approach. It's much more, it's challenging. It's to do with partnerships and understanding context on a level more, deeper. The more you get into these issues, the more sort of endemic they are and harder to tackle. Should we shy away from them though? Absolutely not. And I think the way that legislation is going, this due diligence is there to assess risk and then drive continued improvement and change for the long term. That's where we want to get to.
Yeah,
and I think you mentioned the phrase there, beyond compliance case, and I think obviously that is a trend that we're seeing in this space. Tristan, how do you see that playing out in the responsible sourcing arena?
I think for too long we have been concentrating on a kind of top-down policing attitude, which Kate's talked about there, which sees buyers as the arbiters of what should or shouldn't happen in their supply chain, rather than treating suppliers as collaborative partners to work on issues which, to be honest, a lot of the time buying companies play a role in creating some of those issues to do with their purchasing practices. The way that they buy goods and services isn't always conducive to helping suppliers to achieve responsible sourcing goals. And then actually it's one of the first places to look at, rather than the old compliance model, which is, here are some standards, you have to meet them, and if you don't, there will be consequences, which doesn't really work.
And so you mentioned that. Oh, sorry, Kate, carry on.
No, it's all right. I've just kind of your question a few questions ago was about improvements, and linked to that, it's really important that a site, a business is able to understand the challenges that they face, and to see that data for themselves and to manage those risks accordingly for themselves. So I think another trend that we're seeing actually is sort of data sitting more at business level, not top down level, So you're getting things like certifications, supplier-led certification schemes, which I think is fantastic. You know, things like the Better Buying Institute, which is about supplier assessments of procurement practices of buyers. It's kind of inverting the way that we've been doing this for so long. I think you definitely still need both approaches, and there's, you know, other approaches beyond that, but it's the complementarity of these approaches that give you a fuller idea of what the risks are and how best to manage them.
Yeah, I mean, if you're coming to responsible sourcing for the first time and suddenly you're presented with what are some quite complex issues in your supply chain, then the advice is you know, you probably still do need elements of a compliance program for your long tail of suppliers. So, you know, a typical company will have many hundreds of direct suppliers, and you can't do that collaborative, in-depth thinking and work with each supplier. But you'll probably have 20 suppliers that you do 60% of your business with. And those are the ones you need to go and visit, sit down with, review audits in detail and help them to improve and take that next level of partnership and not taking a policing approach with those suppliers.
And being driven by where the risks have been identified. You know, a lot of supply chains, it's fine. It's fine. Go with, if a risk is highlighted, go deep on that piece, right? On that commodity, on that chain, on that category. But
like you say, that then the industries and sites don't exist in isolation. They're part of an ecosystem. And Tristan, you spoke a little bit there around how the buyers can help the suppliers by spending time with them. You know, I know from Sedex's point of view, we believe in continuous improvement, and actually where risks are identified, we want to work with suppliers to improve them rather than look at ending relationships, which is kind of the nuclear option, so to speak, which does results in worse conditions potentially for workers in those sites. What are the other ways that buyers can help their suppliers with this?
So do you want me to talk a little bit about purchasing practices then?
I think
so. The way that buyers can help suppliers is that obviously buyers have to get a good price, but often buyers think that's the start and the end of the conversation. But there are lots of other things that can help suppliers and not just price. So one is forecasting, is giving your supplier visibility of your plans for the year. And you know, you may not be able to give them absolute certainty, but if you can give them an indication, then that really helps. The other one is how you sample your product. So certainly in the fashion industry, you'll find that an inexperienced buyer will end up having 3 or 4 samples sent back and forth with the supplier. And that closes down the window of how much time that factory has to produce an item. So you might go from an 8-week window when everyone can do, you know, their 48-hour week and it's fine, the factory doesn't have to pay overtime, and you find that the sampling process is poor, and suddenly you've only got 4 weeks. And to meet that delivery date, which to be honest, you know, it's difficult to change, everyone's got to do overtime, the factory has to pay those overtime wages. So that's one really important way. The other way is really is to train your buyers on communication. And you find, I've seen a lot of communication between, you know, retailers sitting in, or big businesses sitting in the West and their suppliers sitting in the Far East, and you can see that people are just not understanding each other, and you find that delivery dates slip, and that the process doesn't work, and suddenly that supplier is forced to make everyone do overtime again.
It's interesting what you talk about there, even just looking at that, what buyers can do to help. You highlighted again the commercial benefits of this, whether it's reduced overtime, etc., in terms of that cost. Absolutely. In terms of measuring the impact, not outputs, Kate, what's the kind of the biggest advice that we're seeing, or from yourself, in this space for businesses? What should they be looking at specifically to help them along this journey?
I mean, it's a big one, isn't it? You know, businesses aren't NGOs, they don't have like teams of researchers gathering data and, you kind of the nerdy assessment frameworks and so on. Realistically, businesses have often limited resources. I think we're being driven by different drivers. There's obviously requirements to publish and report in different ways in different contexts. I won't go into the detail of that. So obviously meet your legal requirements. I think the pressure at the moment is to obviously make sure you know what you're doing. So think about your activities and try and define what you're trying to change through your activities as your absolute starting point. And then consider it to be a journey, really. You can't achieve results on day one. A lot of, the most progressive companies have been trying to do this for years to varying grades of success. I think the really excellent ones actually admit when they've tried something and it hasn't worked out so well and what they've learned from that. So it's about being open-minded to trying new things, having an idea of what you're trying to change or achieve at the beginning of your process, and then going back and testing it, learning and improving and testing it. And the conversation we're just having about commercial and impact, I think is really critical. I think bigger picture in the world, I think we are seeing a bit of a shift in the way we think about impact, and it is becoming, again, being led by the big company, big leaders I'm talking about, are seeing a commercial benefit to sort of impact, right, where they can demonstrate their results and their products and services are completely aligned with a sort of stated end goal that makes the world a better place. We are seeing increasingly commercial benefits to that. Of course, that's a tiny percentage really of global industry. So it's going to take, if that's the end goal, it's going to take time for other businesses to get there. But I would definitely, some of the best performance I've seen has been at supply level, where an ambition has been set, it's been achieved, reported against, and it's sort of this virtuous cycle of improvement by learning and keep trying.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that, and I'd add that a lot of businesses, but it comes back to our first point about putting workers front and center, is that the real impact has got to be on the conditions on the ground and what workers think about that, and not just directly for their own labour rights, but also for environment and for environmental conditions and the communities around suppliers and what they think about those environmental pressures and health and safety as well. And if you and it brings a little bit in the technology piece, which is it's much easier now for us to access workers and to ask them directly through lots of different technologies. I think smartphone penetration in supply chains is really high now. So you can ask them directly, is this having an impact on your life? Are you happier at work? Are you going to stay at this business longer? Are you happy to do longer hours or not? Are you being listened to at work or not? And those conversations and the data that come out from those conversations need to be reported, and it doesn't cost the money that it used to cost. And that's where technology is, not a nirvana, because you have to design these systems properly, and they're not always easy to design and implement. If you get it right, then you can really measure your impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And looking at technology as the enabler rather than the panacea. And like you say, it still needs people to be looking at it, using it, and acting on the data that's there. But sometimes it's just starting with requesting to see that data and have that contact and get that information. That's where everything starts, is that desire to act and look at that data. I'm conscious of time, guys, and we've got quite a few questions coming in. So if it's all right with you, Tristan and Kate, I might start putting you on the spot, more so than I have already, if that's all right. So please do keep them coming in. I will get to as many of these as I can. So first one, and perhaps one that is on everyone's mind, and that someone's put, how did COVID impact responsible sourcing? I think I'd probably say, how does COVID impact responsible sourcing? To you first, Tristan, that's all right.
I mean, from a very initial basic impact, it put workers' lives at risk, and lots of workers were pressured to carry on working in factories, and not all factories and farms had the right measures in place to begin with, and we saw outbreaks. That that problem, from my work in UK factories, has largely been resolved, and I think also in most of the other regions, that big manufacturing regions, that initial risk has subsided. Now we're on to the kind of follow-on risk impacts of COVID, which is that for a long time people weren't buying stuff, and now everyone wants to buy stuff, and we're seeing a real supply chain crisis and a pressure on suppliers to fulfill those orders and make up for lost sales and lost time. So that's happening, and then we're having these variant outbreaks, of which hopefully Omicron is the last one, but there's a very good chance it won't be. And then we're having individuals still continuing spikes. Sedex created very quickly a virtual audit in order to be able to allow our auditors to visit sites. And so out of this sort of crisis has come an opportunity to test that, and it's been very, very successful. We're seeing broadly similar detection rates with virtual audits than we do with a traditional audit, and we're building that learning into our next iteration of SMETA, our audit protocol, you know, in terms of the kind of advantages of doing a lot of audits remotely. You can't obviously do everything as effectively remotely, but we certainly can make it more efficient, and that's where technology again, you know, plays its part.
I think to build on that, yeah, I mean, COVID's just done weird things to all sorts of supply chains, supply and demand. You know, you've had extremes of overtime and threats to kind of health and safety, and then the other extreme of supply chains being completely decimated overnight because of drop in demand. So it's those sorts of two extremes. I think, as Tristan said, moving forwards, this is about ongoing supply chain resilience. There's still a lot that we're still working through, and it's COVID plus other things. You know, from the UK perspective, COVID plus Brexit equals massive labour shortages. Sorry, I'll try not to, but you know,
no B word, yeah.
That we're trying to deal with, and that in itself brings really positive things potentially in terms of how workers are treated and building longer term, more, you know, effective relationships with management and up the supply chain. But it's also risk. You've got high turnover of staff and so on. It's harder to manage, and I think we'll continue to see that throughout the year. And of course, this isn't just the UK, right? You know, the whole world is tackling this problem in different ways at the moment. It's not going to change this year, I think.
I think unfortunately it's here to stay, but I think that's, you know, that's why we're talking about what we're talking about today, those trends and what can be addressed and how businesses can be supportive and supported in this space. We've had a question around legislation. Now, we mentioned EU due diligence a little bit earlier. What role does legislation play, and how proactive should companies be in reaction to it?
Should I go? So it's a good question, and it's on everyone's minds, right? So I think from a European perspective, there's been a lot of change in the last 3-4 years, really, to do with 5 years maybe, to do with due diligence legislation. We've seen, you know, there's a German Supply Chain Act, a Norwegian Transparency Act, there's something coming in, a Dutch due diligence agreement coming soon maybe, and then obviously the EU. From the UK, we had in 2015 the Modern Slavery Act as our kind of benchmark first approach to due diligence. Was the question about how proactive businesses should be?
Yeah. So I mean, you've got a lot of legislation there, but what should businesses be doing now?
What does it mean?
Yeah.
I mean, so while we don't know the content of upcoming laws, we can have a pretty good stab at knowing what they're going to say. You know, the EU due diligence legislation, it will be about demonstrating that you've got the right processes in place for assessment, prevention, and remedy at that kind of level. So I think members of Sedex will be well equipped to sort of demonstrate some effectiveness there in terms of that risk assessment approach. But as we said right at the beginning, audit isn't everything. So it's about how you build on that risk assessment. I think the legislation will drive a need for continued improvement, like we've seen with the UK Modern Slavery Act. You don't just do it 1 year and then that's it. It's about how you build on your last year report. I suspect other legislation will follow that same kind of approach.
Okay, Tristan, anything to add?
No, I think Kate's covered it all.
Okay, excellent. Another question we've had come in, slightly different in the tech space. Do you see any potential in blockchain in this arena?
Yes. So
right then, okay, good.
To sort of unpack it a little bit, blockchain having an open registry of transactions, so that which can't be changed, is beginning to have an impact on the ability of big business and small business to track where their product is, who's touched it, and what's happened to it. I don't know enough beyond that, and I know there are businesses, I know there's who are already commercializing it, and it's something that we want to find out more about, but I haven't heard about it making the kind of impact that it's promised yet. And that's the kind of, if you look at Sedex and other businesses I've worked at, you don't want to be at the bleeding edge of technology, maybe not even the cutting edge. You kind of want to be just ahead of the herd a bit. And so far, I haven't seen quite how blockchain is going to revolutionize things. But once it begins to show promise, then we'll want to know more.
Okay, brilliant, great. What questions coming around? How do the trends we've been discussing differ from one continent to another? So, Kate, when you were talking about legislation there, you talked a lot about Europe. How do the trends we're seeing, whether it's in technology, workers' voice, or measuring impact, differ from one continent to another?
That's a really good question.
Why, thank you.
Yeah, whoever sent that one in, it's a really good question. I think there's a number of ways to answer that. There's sort of international level agreements, UN guiding principles, sustainable development goals, international level, which cuts across everywhere. And they're the kind of guiding frameworks that many countries are working towards. At the national level, I think we do see wild variations in, let's face it, human rights and how respected human rights are. There's also wild variations in the way that business is conducted, and the drivers for profit in different countries differ, right? So it's really hard to go further than that in terms of detail, but I think the wild variations bit has always been and will ever be, which is why I think going right back to the beginning, that due diligence process is really critical to stay on top of what's changing and to not make assumptions about what's changing as well. If your key market is in a country that suddenly slips into a state of conflict or near conflict, does that mean you should cut and run? I mean, I can think of a few countries right now that have that. Many businesses are facing that question about. The short answer is no, but what does it mean to still source from a geography where it is increasingly challenging to maintain rule of law, to support workers' rights, to pay an effective salary, etc., etc. So manage your risk, right? Stay on top of it. Don't cut and run.
Excellent. Oh, sorry, Tristan.
I think that perhaps the interesting thing about regional differences, perhaps not the differences, but the convergence, and that workers around the world, I've heard so many times from factory managers and from buyers that, workers in the global south, they want to do 80 hours a week. They're desperate for the overtime. They're migrant workers who want to spend 9 months of a year in a factory doing nothing but working to send money home and go back to their hometown. And that just isn't true in large parts of the world anymore. It's certainly not true in China. I think it's reduced greatly in other big manufacturing businesses. And actually, people around the world, they want, poverty isn't over, but in a lot of places, that kind of abject poverty and the increase in workers' wages has meant that workers in factories and farms are a bit more like us. They don't want to work every hour God sends, and they want to be able to live their life in wherever they move to and self-actualize and to increase their skills. And so I think it's slightly overblown, this idea of, you know, and it comes back to the worker voice piece about, you know, those poor people in the global south and what we think they should have, but more about, you know, bringing forward the worker voice goal of understanding what people really want to work in factories and farms that we source from, and it isn't always what you think, and it's they're a lot more like you than you think.
It's dignity, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
We've another question, potentially one for you, Tristan. How do you view ethical sourcing versus responsible sourcing?
Ethical sourcing, responsible sourcing. I don't know. I think in the industry we use the two. Ethical trade, ethical sourcing is perhaps a bit older. That's maybe where it first started, and I'm not sure it's such a useful way of dividing the world. The two are largely synonymous, I think. Ethical sourcing perhaps has more of an emphasis on the kind of labour rights piece, and responsible sourcing encompasses all the other elements of sustainable supply chains. And, you know, sustainability is not just about environment; it's about economics, and it's about the social side. So I much prefer responsible sourcing.
I'd agree. I think responsible sourcing is just a bit broader in terms of its remit. Ethical trade historically has been sort of the labour standards approach.
And actually picking up on that, I think it's a follow-on from the same individual. What's the difference between responsible sourcing as opposed to compliance-based strategies? Are they the same?
I mean, I'd say that's you know, as we've been talking about today, they aren't the same. Compliance-driven approaches are a form of responsible sourcing. It's a type of responsible sourcing, I suppose. And I think the ways to do responsible sourcing better go beyond that compliance approach.
Yeah, I agree.
Brilliant. Let me have a quick check if we've got any further questions coming in. So bear with me, guys. If we're talking about workers being involved in environmental initiatives that don't immediately benefit them, how does that sit, you know, in embedding these kind of policies?
Environmental initiatives. Well, it's interesting because I think last year a clean environment became a UN right. Yeah. So I think what we're seeing is a merging of the ESG as blocks. You know, they are completely connected, really. And the right to a clean environment. So I don't know what the root of that question, but if you're talking about environmental initiatives, better water is a good thing for human beings as well. So I think increasingly we're seeing, you know, they should be one and the same thing. From an impact perspective, what you want is that complete convergence where you don't have issues kind of pulling against each other. And I think that we are moving beyond that sort of concept where actually they are together, they are complementary, and should be managed together as well. So you don't have a separate department looking at that over there and that over, you know, in a separate department there. They're looking at impact more holistically is the way forwards.
Yeah, I think for a lot of workers in countries that are you know, manufacturing regions, environmental impacts are very real for them, in perhaps ways that they aren't for us. And they probably have a greater environmental awareness of how negatively you can be impacted by effluent discharge into drinking water or solid waste, you know, clogging up your countryside than we perhaps see. So I think the premise of the question is not quite right. You know, I think, to be honest, I haven't seen an instance where workers aren't interested in the environmental consequences of where they work.
Just on that, because this is a trend piece, you know, we had the climate negotiations last year, COP26. I think in the run up to the COP discussions and through this year, there's a narrative called just transition. This idea that we can't tackle one without the other, right? So people have this right to a clean environment, and the way in which we get there has to bring people with us. So if from a factory or farm sort of perspective, that's about engaging workers in, exactly as Tristan says, they know better than anyone what those issues are. Can that voice be brought to the fore so that we're tackling the right issues in the right order, in the right sequence?
Yeah,
Brilliant.
and if
Oh, sorry guys, conscious of time, and I've got one last question, Tristan, but after you make your point.
If you're a company and you're visiting one of your suppliers, then environment performance is quite a leading indicator for everything else in the business. So it's difficult to separate them. You know, if you come across a business and they've got a perfect way of, you know, they say all the workers are completely satisfied and there's no health and safety problems, but you spot that the effluent treatment plant is not switched on and it's spewing out effluent into the river, then to be honest, I would see that as quite an indication that perhaps not everything is right. Not that business is not managing its risks properly.
Okay. So a hard one to end on, guys. Ethical compliance always comes with a cost. How do you justify?
So I've just finished reading a fantastic book, which I'm going to plug, called Net Positive by Paul Polman, who's the ex-CEO of Unilever. Unilever have been in the news a lot recently. But if you think about what they've managed to achieve as a business, it's quite phenomenal. There's a wealth of data in there, which I haven't got at my fingertips, to do with costs, right? And initial investment of doing this better. Yes, there is a cost, but the long-term gain is significant. And I think that's the way to think of it, is definitely track your kind of return on investment indicators. You want to see what's happening. You want to see if productivity is increasing or absenteeism is decreasing. You want to see all of that, of course, but look at it short, medium, and then long-term, because really this is about a long-term game and a long-term alignment of social value, social impact with the commercial gain.
Yeah, I read an interview with the former CEO of Unilever recently, and when he took, whose name I forget,
Same one, Paul Pullman, same guy.
Oh, is it? Okay, there you go.
Yeah. We should be on commission.
he binned quarterly reporting when he joined, because he didn't want that kind of short-termist cost-cutting thinking to influence the way that he then initiated one of the most far-reaching and effective sustainability programs of any big business. And the earnings that Unilever then achieved over the period of his tenure resulted in a many-fold increase in profit, but not just because of sustainability, but as part of a broader strategy. So the premise that it always costs money, that like anything in life, to do things well takes a little bit of effort and an investment, but that the payback is huge.
Brilliant. Well, listen, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to Tristan and to Kate for your time with us. For attendees, thank you for staying with us and enjoying the session. We'll be sending out a recording. Please feel free to share that with your colleagues. And if you're interested to find out more about how Sedex can help your business, whether that's through membership or bespoke consulting, please reach out to us at communications@sedex.com or contact us via our website. Thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.